To how to break down a paper, how to decipher it. Um, so this is not easy. All of you, mentioned in the poll that, all of you rated yourselves like on a 3 scale of a 5. So hopefully after I break this down for you, I want all of you to get to a 5 comfort level in being able to read papers and decipher them. Obviously, this is a skill just like any other skill. I'm a big sports nut, so I like to use sports analogy. The first time I picked up a baseball bat, when I was a kid and somebody threw a baseball at me, I swung and I missed. I'm pretty sure, that I wasn't very good at hitting a baseball when I was a kid. And it took a lot of practice, right? The more pitches, the more swings, the more batting practice, the more games I played, the better I got at hitting the baseball. And that's just like any other skill in the world, right? And so reading these papers is exactly the same, okay? Reading these papers is a skill, and you will get better at it. So the first time you have to read a journal paper, you're probably going to take 5 hours trying to break it down. But the more papers you read, the better you get at these skills, the faster you'll be able to decipher it. And your faculty member can probably read a paper once and get like 90% of the gist of what's happening. And by the time they read it a second time, they get to 100%. But because they've read thousands, hundreds and thousands of papers throughout their career. So, you're likely starting at paper 1 or paper 10. So it is what it is. You're going to get better. So hopefully with these tips, you'll get to a 5 comfort level pretty soon, for sure by the end of the summer research program. Okay, so let's break it down. The abstract is usually the first part of this paper. It covers the following information. It covers the purpose and the rationale of the study. Why did they do this work? If the abstract does not address this, it's a poorly written paper. Because really, if I'm a faculty member, I don't have time to read a million journal articles. Like, I just don't have that much time. I'm going to pick and choose which journal articles I read, and I'm going to make that decision based on what's written in the abstract. If the purpose and rationale makes sense to me and it has a real world application, something that relates to the research I'm doing and related to my work, then if I understand why they did it, then I'm more likely to read the paper. In the abstract, it should introduce very briefly the methodology. How did they do the work? Was this a simulation? Was this, an algorithm? Was this an experimental protocol? Did they use a specific method? A certain assay, or whatever the research is about? It should explain the methodology. And again, this helps the reader decide, do I want to spend the next hour of my life reading this paper, or is it not relevant to my work? Results, what they found. There should be a 1-sentence, 2-sentence synopsis in the abstract that says, this is what we found. And then a conclusion, what it means. So the whole paper should be summarized. An abstract is essentially an executive summary of the entire paper in 150, 250 words. So it's very dense writing. It's very difficult writing. But this will help somebody decide if they want to continue reading or not. In your case, you have no choice. You should be reading this because you just don't know this information and you need to learn it in order to properly do your research project. But in the regular general science world, this helps, scientists read the abstract first, and that helps them decide if they want to read the rest of the paper. So definitely read the abstract carefully. Try and make sure you understand the abstract. Google every word to make sure you understand what the words mean. You want to understand the abstract before you jump into the entire paper. Okay, the introduction of the article. So again, the whole point of the introduction is kind of like the introductory paragraph of any piece of writing. It's to capture the reader's interests, right? Provide them the background information, the why, the importance. I always tell students to start with the real world application. Sometimes, unfortunately, engineers have the stigma of being bad communicators. Where they just jump right into the algorithm. They just jump right into the technical jargon. And most people, the general lay audience, your grandmother would be like, what the heck are you talking about? I don't understand a word you're saying right now. You're literally speaking a different language. And unfortunately, many of these papers are written that way. Hopefully you find a good paper, a good writer who says, look, this is why this matters. This is how it applies to the real world before I jump into those nitty gritty details. So that's what should be in the introduction. You should be leading the writer should be leading the readers and starting with broad information, and then I call it the hourglass method, where you start with real world applications that everybody can understand. Like, this technology will be used to point a wearable device at an image, and the wearable device will be able to identify what that image is, right? So image recognition. So that's a real world general application that everybody will understand. Be like, ooh, that's cool. I can point my Apple Watch at a fan, and the Apple Watch will tell me that that's a fan. Or I can point it at a car, and it'll tell me the make, model, and year that the car was built. That's cool stuff. I want to read this paper now because that makes sense, right? Something I understand in the real world. It's a real world application. All engineering projects, 100% of engineering projects have a real world application. You just have to figure out what it is. And hopefully the paper does that in the introduction. Okay, moving on. So this is what you're looking for, obviously, in each of these aspects of the paper. Materials and methods. This is where, this is where it gets really difficult. It gets really technical. It gets really specific. It's basically, what exactly did they do? And it's really hard for you as a new to research person to understand the materials and method. There's a lot of technical language, which you're going to have to look up. You're going to have to Google. And that's why that review paper really helps, because if you can read the review paper, it will explain that technical language before, so you get a background kind of, it's like a dictionary, right? It'll tell you what it is, so you know how to interpret what you're reading. The whole point of materials and methods is in the research world. So when they're writing these papers, the whole point of this is so that somebody else, any other scientist in the world can read the materials and method and duplicate the experiment, duplicate the research. Because again, in the research world, the way science works, if somebody can't duplicate, if I claim that I discovered the cure to cancer and I publish it, and then 100 scientists out there go and replicate my experiment, my cure supposedly that I have, and 99 of them can't get the same results that I got, then guess what? My work is just discredited. It said like, you know what? I think you made some mistakes because we redid your experiment according to your materials and methods, and it didn't work, right? So the whole point of the materials and methods is for somebody else to take the work and duplicate it. And if they duplicate it and they get the same results, now all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, Will Herrera was right. He cured cancer. Next thing you know, I win a Nobel Peace Prize, right? I win a Nobel laureate. So that's how, that's the whole point of this materials and methods section. The whole point of this, and if you're reading this, you're looking at, can I poke holes in this? Like, if I'm a faculty advisor and I read this paper, I'm like, ooh, they're onto something. That sounds like a good idea. I think I can take that idea and make it better. Or I read it and I'm like, I tried that already. That's not going to work. I already did that experiment in my lab and it didn't work. That methodology didn't work. So you're really evaluating the validity of the experiment. And then, of course, trying to prove that it works. So again, my big tip here is read the review paper first so that you understand the materials and methods, you understand that the technical jargon. All right, the next section of a paper is the results and discussion section. Okay, so the results should be just a statement of what they found. It should just be data presentation. It should be data graphs. It should be data tables, right? And the hardest part of this section is really understanding how they're presenting the data. What are the units? What's the scale, right? How, the graph that they're using, like, how does this relate to prior research findings? And again, you want to be able to visually see the data. 99% of papers, have visual representations because, like the old saying, a picture tells 1,000 words. So it's a lot easier to just show visually the data. And then later in writing, they can interpret and analyze and discuss the data. And that's what the discussion is, right? Is where they say, here's the context. So in the data section, the results, it's just the raw data. There's no opinion, there's no analysis, there's no context yet. In the discussion is where you say, okay, this data relates to previous data found in this paper. And this is how our data is better than the last people who did this experiment, right? And so you're trying to one up the last person, right? That's the whole point of doing the literature review and understanding what's been done before, is you're trying to, in order to publish, you're publishing something new, something novel, a new discovery. You're trying to say that you did it better than the last person. And that's what the discussion's all about, is how do my results compare to prior results, and how are my results either better, or in some cases, most of the time, like Professor Potty said, we're failing. Most of the time our results are worse, but that's okay, because a lot of inventions are done by mistake, right? We show that our results are so different than the previous people results that we're onto something new. We're like, oh, maybe the results are different for a different reason. And that's how new discoveries happen. And many of the world's, scientific best discoveries were done on accident. And as a result of getting bad data and trying to explain, well, why is my data so bad? Why is it so different than the prior data? And it's like, oh, because I'm onto something new. And sometimes the most exciting data is not saying that it's not reaffirming what we already knew, but actually showing that there's something totally different that we don't know yet. And I just discovered something. So don't be discouraged if you're getting quote unquote bad data. Sometimes that could be a new invention, a new discovery. It could also be just that you did a really bad experiment and you didn't follow the right protocol and you didn't do it the way they described it in the methodology. And so, you got to do it again. And that's why research is so repetitive and so iterative, because you keep doing it over and over and over again, tweaking, doing it a little bit differently so that you can get better results. Okay. So those are kind of the different pieces of the paper. Hopefully that breaks it down for you. What I want to do now is these are the questions you should be asking yourself before reading the paper and after reading the paper. And if you can find answers to these questions, it will help your understanding of the paper, and it will make you more efficient and faster at reading these papers if you're able to answer these questions, for yourself before reading the paper. So who are the authors? What journal is this? What publication is it? There's a hierarchy of publications. Nature, science are like the pinnacle. They're the elite, the Harvards, the MITs, the UCLAs of the world. They're the elite journals. And then there are smaller journals that are less prestigious, but still, important. And then who are the authors? How many times have they been cited? How many times do they publish? Like, how prestigious are they in the research world? And then the terminology, you really do have to read those review papers and understand all that technical jargon before you can break it down, right? So if you read a paragraph that has 200 words in it, and 50 of those words are completely new words you've never heard of before, you have no idea what they mean, it's going to be really hard for you to understand that paragraph, right? So you have to kind of, you have to go back, and break down those terms, that technical jargon. And again, the review paper, I think, is the best way of doing that. And you also have obviously dictionaries or Wikipedia. Before you read, have you gone back to read the article, the review article, that would help you understand the work better? That's kind of redundant. I already said that. After reading the paper, what specific problems does this research address, right? And again, they should be able to identify that in the abstract, in the introduction. But if it's not clearly identified, then you need to figure it out. Like, what is the big research question here? What problem, what are they trying to solve, right? Why is this research important? And if you can't identify why it's important, then that's a really poorly written paper. And, is the research really important? Like, does it matter? If you can't figure it out, then that's a problem. And you should be asking your graduate student. That's a great discussion topic for you and your graduate student. And that's part of the homework that I'm going to give you at the end here. Number two, what are the specific findings? Like, what's the big essence? What's the takeaway? Like, what can I summarize in 2 sentences what the big point of this journal article was about? And, again, this is a skill that you will get better at. At first, it's going to be really hard for you to do this. But after reading your 10th paper and your 20th paper and your 100th paper and your 1000th paper, you will get really good at this. You will be like, oh, I got this. It's like reading comprehension, right? Like, as a kid in elementary school, when you were reading, at first it was really hard to figure out what you were reading. But then as you read more books and you got better at reading, you could easily read something and say, okay, I got it. I understand what they're saying, right? It's just kind of like second nature. So with these research papers, because it's so technical and it's so much jargon, it's hard to do, but you will get better at it. And you really need to push yourself and ask yourself in 2 sentences, what was the essence of that paper? What is the major takeaway. And then the third thing you need to be asking yourself is, are the findings supported with persuasive evidence? Are the results good, basically? You got to critically analyze, is this good research? Is this something that I will be able to replicate in my research lab? And do I want to replicate it? Or am I looking at it and saying, you know what, that doesn't sound right. They messed up. They did this wrong. You know, and of course, as a new person to this research area, it's going to be hard for you to know what they did wrong. You're just going to kind of, at first, when you read something, you know nothing about it, you just take it as fact. You're like, oh, okay, they're right, I'm wrong, because I don't know enough to be able to say that they're wrong, right? So that's natural, that's normal. But the more you read, the more you understand the project, the more you read review papers, the more journal papers you read that are related to this area, the deeper your understanding will be and your confidence level will build. So you'll say, oh, I know enough about this to say that they're wrong. And that's what you want to build up to, right? And you may not be there at the beginning, but you want to get there as quickly as possible. You know, Jared mentioned something yesterday in our meeting that said, at the beginning, you are a drain on the lab, right? You have to be taught, you have to be trained, you have to be onboarded, you have to be handheld and walk through and taught all this stuff. And you want to reach this tipping point where you are no longer a drain, you are an asset to the lab. You've learned enough background information, you understand the research project so well that you can work almost independently. You can work on your own, and you're adding value to the lab. You're actually contributing and not draining resources from the lab, because you're able to work on your own independently. And I know this is a huge ask for you to be able to do this in an 8-week program, but trust me, it can be done. And that's your goal, right? Your goal is to get to that tipping point where you're no longer a drain, you're actually adding value. And here's one thing that you should know. Sometimes these researchers get stuck because their head is so deep in the weeds and so deep into their research project that they forget what it's like to have that worldly view, that kind of stepping out and above the project and looking down on it. And you'll be shocked, but you will ask questions. Your inquisitive mind and how you're learning, and the questions you ask are questions that are coming from the high level kind of, not really understanding the project in the weeds yet. Those questions are totally going to help them to step out of the weeds and say, oh my God, how could I not have thought about that? That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. And you are really going to help them. You don't feel that way, but trust me, you will, because you're coming at this project from a completely new, different lens, from this place of not knowing, and they're coming from a place of expertise where they don't think of things. And so, really don't feel embarrassed to ask a lot of questions. Don't feel embarrassed to poke holes in what they're doing. Ask those difficult questions. And trust me, at some point, they're going to be like, thank you for asking that. I can't believe that I haven't addressed that. You're totally right. Let me address that. And it's going to help them. Okay, so you will become an asset to the lab at some point during this summer, hopefully sooner rather than later. Okay, so to wrap up, how are we doing on time? Yeah, it's 10:08. Okay, good. To start wrapping up here, here are some tools for you to kind of find to start reading papers. So in conclusion, you really need to build your prerequisite knowledge in the field. The more prior knowledge you're able to learn from the review papers, reading a chapter in a textbook or whatever it is, whatever resources your lab gave you, get that baseline knowledge. And if they didn't give you enough resources, ask for more, or find them yourself. Now that I've taught you how to use PubMed to find review articles. Understand the importance of the abstract, the conclusion, and future work. Future work is very, very important. I didn't mention that in the discussion. A good discussion section has, like, here's what we learned and here's what we're going to do next. And that is basically saying, here's what we learned from this and here's what we're going to try differently next time around. And so you really do want to look at that future work. You want to be critical of the results. Don't just accept it as fact because it's not fact. You need to read it with a critical lens. You want to be able to poke holes in it. You want to check back to the intro So you're going to be rereading this paper many times, right? One read is definitely not enough. You're probably going to be 10 times in before you have that aha moment and be like, oh, I get it now. This makes sense. So the more you reread it, the better. Every time you reread, again, start really trying to get to the essence of what is this about. Is the research really proposing something novel and new? Is it worthwhile? You want to take notes on the general structure, the main points, the questions, and the inferences, because as you take those notes, those are going to be the lead questions that you're going to have when you want to discuss this paper with your daily lab supervisor. So the reason they gave you this paper, by the way, even if they didn't instruct you, they want you to come back and say, break down the paper for me. Let's talk about it. I want to know what you understand, and I want to hear your questions. They want to have a discussion about the paper. So if you haven't had that discussion with them, hopefully after today's TPL, this will help you have a much more fruitful and better discussion. And in fact, that is your homework for this TPL. Skimming through and leaving irrelevant stuff. So at first, you're going to have to just scan things and say, okay, I don't understand that yet. Let me just skip it. Let me get to the rest of it. The more you understand the essence of it, the basics, then when you reread, you're going to be able to go deeper and understand those things that you passed up the first time around. So every read, you should be getting a deeper level understanding of the paper. The first read, you're skipping a lot of stuff, and that's okay. Skip the stuff that's not relevant, the stuff that you really don't understand. You can come back to that later. The expectation of the lab of you is that you just get the essence of the paper, the basic understanding. And then as you have those discussions with them, they will help you to get to the deeper level understanding. You definitely are going to want to compare this with other papers. So you should not just be reading one paper, right? You need to read the review paper. You need to find other related journal articles. The more you read, the more context you know about this paper, right? So you want to be able to compare and contrast to previous work. So here are my final tips. Read critically, okay? It's a critical process. Don't assume that they're right. Instead, you need to be suspicious. And the better you're able to poke holes in it, that means that you're really getting to understand the work and the depth of it. Read creatively. Reading the paper is pretty easy for people who understand the topic. It's easy to criticize things. It's easy to say, oh, that's wrong. You're doing it incorrectly. That's not going to work. The negative Nancy type statements, right? It's easy to break something down. It's much harder to give suggestions, right? It's harder to be positive, to be making connections, to be able to say, you know what? Most of that is wrong, but this piece is right. And if I take this piece, I have a solution. I can make this better, right? So instead of just saying, this is what's wrong with it, you want to say, this is what's wrong, and this is how I can solve it. This is how my research project is trying to solve the problem. And in fact, that is one of the best pieces of advice I can give you when you're presenting your research is to say, what is the prior knowledge? What are the problems with that prior knowledge? And then you come in like Superwoman or Superman and say, I'm a savior. I'm going to solve that problem. My research project is able to solve those problems of the previous research, right? So, and you have to really think creatively and think positively as you're reading these papers in order to identify those solutions, in order to identify those new research projects that can come from reading the paper. After the first read through, you really need to summarize it in 1 or 2 sentences. Again, this is going to take practice, but you really want to get to the point where you can do that. So what are your next steps? Ask your daily supervisor for more relevant papers, more relevant resources, any research talks, so any videos that they might have of other presentations around the research. A lot of times, people who publish research will go and present the research in an oral video presentation at a research conference. And sometimes those things are recorded and they're on the website, on the internet somewhere. So try and find a video presentation of the graduate student or the faculty member presenting that research paper. Use the research question to search for more papers. So remember on Google Scholar that you can put anything in that search engine. I told you to put their name, but you could also put a keyword, right? You can put a research methodology. You can put one of those, references from the paper that you read, right? You can also find other famous researchers who have done good work in that area. I wouldn't call it better work, but good work. Who are the experts in this field? Read their paper, because that will give you their expert perspective on the paper. That goes with the next bullet. Read multiple papers, being critical. Don't just try to understand the details, try and poke holes through it. And then the last next step is, there are societies, like if you're an electrical engineer, there's IEEE. If you're a computer science engineer, there's ACM, or UPE. There's different organizations that you can become a member of. And then you get institutional access to those organizations and the papers that they publish. So again, this is probably a more a longer term next step, once you decide that research is your thing and you really enjoy this. But it's definitely a good place for you to on-ramp and start also. Okay. All right. So